the Congress has consolidated, Congress and its allies have consolidated the minority, particularly the Muslim vote, which is a very significant vote bloc. They were, as of the last census, somewhere between 14 to 15% of the population in 2011. I'm sure because of higher fertility rates. The right, at the very least, has the incentive to try and alter certain elements of India's constitution. The Indian left is far more satisfied with the constitutional and even statutory status quo, because for most of India's history, it has been the Congress party and even the Janata parties, who arguably be on the left, who have been ruling India. The path forward for the right is going to be a lot harder than the path forward for the left, even if the right keeps winning elections and forming governments. Because every law that the right wants to change is going to require a majority not just in the Lok Sabha but in the Rajya Sabha. And the Rajya Sabha is not first past the post, it's proportional representation. Once an entitlement passes, it's very hard to take it back. And therefore, even if that leads to backlash and maybe electoral punishment, the status quo has been once changed and it remains changed. The kind of democracy that we have in India today is called first past the post system. Given geographic constituency, whichever party wins the highest percentage of votes, this kind of system favors parties that have relatively geographically concentrated bases, and it also favors parties that are able to divide their opposition and ensure that their vote is split. As incomes rise, we also see inequality rises. And this typically happens for a while, after which inequality declines. But it does tend to create resentments. In India, that identity turns out to be caste. The topic today is the future of Indian democracy, centrifugal forces versus centripetal ideologies. Does anyone remember centripetalism and centrifugalism from physics?
Yeah, inward and outward.
Exactly. So let's start by discussing what just happened in the recent elections a couple of months ago, right? The National Democratic Alliance won a majority of its own, but the BJP itself as a ruling party did not. So now we have formed a coalition government. This is not unusual in the history of Indian politics. In fact, after the first few decades, this has been the norm. And it was only the past decade that we've had full majority governments again. Now, what does this tell us? So the kind of democracy that we have in India today is called first past the post system. And in a first past the post system, given geographic constituency, whichever party wins the highest percentage of votes gets that seat. So that can be as low as 25% or 22%. You don't need anywhere close to 50% or a majority in that constituency in order to be able to win that seat. So the more divided a given constituency is, the lower the percentage of votes you'll need to get to actually win that seat, right? So because of this, because it's an aggregation, our democracy is an aggregation of 543 different seats. What we end up seeing is that in a general election, you can get one party having 36% or 37% of the vote and still getting 56% of the seats, like happened for the BJP in 2019. So that disparity is there because this kind of system favors parties that have relatively geographically concentrated bases, and it also favors parties that are able to divide their opposition and ensure that their vote is split. So in this kind of system, there is a law called Duerger's law that proposes that in a first past the post system, especially with single balloting. So I should explain what that is. Single balloting means in France, for example, you have a first round of elections where everyone runs for president, and then you have a second round where only the top two contenders run, and whoever wins 50%, they become the president. India doesn't have that either, so it's only one round, right? So if there's only one round and you have first past the post system, then this law called Duerger's law suggests that this kind of system will tend towards having two viable parties that are in contention for national power. And that is what tends to happen over time. Now, we'll have to see if this law has actually been followed in our political trajectory since 1950. And if it has, then we'll have to think about what that suggests for what we're going to see moving forward. So that is going to be the subject of this talk. As you can see, there are areas of geographic concentration for certain parties. So that is one of the exceptions to Duverger's law, is that you can have third parties that are able to win seats, provided there is some regional consolidation that they're able to make. And the other exception is that if you have, then you will never have one party that gets 67% of the vote in any system, because if let's say let's take the example of Kerala, right? So if you want to defeat the BJP there, you will just need to vote for either one of Congress or the Communist bloc, and both of them are capable of defeating the BJP because the BJP does not have more than 33% of the votes. So because the BJP is going to be confined to below 33%, it's a reasonable expectation, you can afford to split your anti-BJP votes, and therefore in such circumstances you can sometimes see three parties being in contention. But the moment the BJP actually gets to a place where it's close to being able to hit 33%, then the current nature of Kerala politics will rapidly shift. So that's why you also see that in the Kashmir Valley, where BJP is not in contention, there are multiple anti-BJP parties that can be voted for. None of them will end up getting 67%. That's the other exception. So we have had 18 general elections from independence until now. This was the 18th. And during this time, the first, so like Duverger says, there will be two major parties, right? So let's call them the two poles. So the first pole of Indian politics for most of this history has been the Congress Party, the Indian National Congress, in its various iterations. So the first several decades of India's electoral history has been the contestation about who will become the second pole of Indian politics. Because there was a general election held for the Central Legislative Council in the December of 1945. And that is where the members of what later became the Constituent Assembly were elected. And a majority of them were members of the Congress, especially once you take out the Muslim League members who left to Pakistan. And because of that, the Congress had a very significant role in shaping the constitution that was developed in the years after that. And as they were representatives, or seen as representatives of the freedom movement, of India's struggle for self-rule, of India's national unification, they emerged in the first election with a very significant block of support. And there were multiple smaller parties that were contending to oppose him. So the biggest one in the first election was actually a bloc that developed from the Congress Socialist Party. So the Congress Socialist Party started as a coalition within the Congress, as a caucus within the Congress in 1934. And after independence, they broke free from the Congress, and there were multiple socialist parties, and together they got 18% in the first election in 1952. And the next biggest, of course, was the Communist bloc, which started out with, I think, close to 6%, and then eventually grew to 10% in the next election in 1957. And from 1962 until 2009, it maintained somewhere between 8 to 11% of the national vote share. Of course, the Communist Party itself broke up in the 1960s, but the Communist parties together have had 8 to 11%. In 2014, it came down to 5% for the first time because they lost their strongholds in Tripura and West Bengal, and now in the last two election cycles, the Communist Party's combined tally has come down to below 2.5%. And the other poll that emerged in about 1960 was the Swatantra Party, which was a classical liberal party. They said that they opposed central planning and state-led socialism, and they wanted more of a role for markets, and they were a secular party. So this was, as it turned out, largely dependent on the charisma of one individual, Chakravarti Rajagopalachari. So the party did grow during the 1960s and had 8 to 9% vote share in a couple of election cycles. But by 1971, because of bad alliances and perhaps other reasons, they declined to 3%. And then when Rajaji died in 1972, the party essentially lost its role as a contender for power, and a lot of the party members went and joined Charan Singh, and the party just merged with other parties. So that was another of the polls. And then, of course, the biggest one that ended up succeeding in becoming the second pole was the ideology of Hindutva. There were three parties in the beginning that claimed to represent Hindutva consciousness. One was the Bharatiya Janasangh, which was started by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who himself was in the past a Hindu Mahasabha leader. The other was the Hindu Mahasabha. And the third was the Ram Rajya Parishad, led by Swami Karpatri Maharaj. And in the first election, the Bharatiya Janasangh got 3% of the national vote, the Ram Rajya Parishad got 2%, and the Hindu Mahasabha got 1%. Before independence, the Hindu Mahasabha had a substantially larger presence, but given Mahatma Gandhi's assassination by Nathuram Godse, a member of the Hindu Mahasabha, they had become very unpopular afterwards, and the brand has since never recovered. So they, in future election cycles, were relegated to being relevant only in one constituency, which was Gorakhpur. Mahant Avaidhyanath and Mahant Digvijay Nath won the seat in 1989 and 1967 respectively, and of course Mahant Avaidhyanath eventually ended up joining the BJP in the next election in 1991, and his successor is Yogi Adityanath, the current Chief Minister of UP. As for the Ram Rajya Parishad, they contested in 52, 57 and 62. And by 62, their support had dwindled to less than 0.4% of the national vote. So they also merged their party with the Bharatiya Janasangh. The Janasangh, of course, emerged as the most powerful voice on the Hindutva side. So they started out with 3%. In the second election in 1957, they went to 6%, and then to 7% in 1962, and then in 67 they emerged as the second largest party by vote share. They had more than 9%. In 71 it declined slightly to 7%. So then, of course, in 77 we all know what happened. That was after the emergency had been imposed, and many parties had come together with a hodgepodge of ideologies to form what was called the Janata Party. And this was a historic election because it was the first time in Indian history that the Congress was not the largest party in terms of vote share. And it was also the first time the Congress, of course, lost power. So this Janata Party was the largest block of MPs within the Janata Party was actually from the Janasangh, what was the erstwhile Janasangh. So that was a turning point in India's democratic history, where democracy deepened and the polarization took a different direction. In 1980, of course, the Janata Party lost power and broke apart into several different factions, and then started the BJP, which was a successor to the Janasangh. And the BJP in 1984 again had the second largest vote share, which was 7-point-something%. Then by 1989, they had gone to 11%. And the Janata Party had a successor in Janata Dal. Of course, the Janata Party itself also existed. And the Janata Dal was led by VP Singh, a former Congress defector. He formed the government with the support of both the BJP as well as the communists. And he had about 17.7% of the national vote share. But this government didn't last for very long, and within 2 years there was another election where the BJP's vote share had gone from 11% to 20%. Now, why was there this massive growth at that point? Because no other party other than the Congress had hit 20% until then in the Indian electoral system. The main reason for that was, of course, I should make an exception. No other party except the Janata Party in 1977. That was again because of the emergency mobilization. But other than that, no other party had hit that level. So why was it possible? It was because of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement. And this movement galvanized people from across the country and eventually propelled the BJP to above 20% in national vote share, which is what made them a real contender for power after that. And in every election since, the BJP and the Congress have been in the number 1 and number 2 spots. And after 1998, we've not even had governments formed by third parties. They've all been Congress-led governments or BJP-led governments. So this is broadly what has happened in terms of the electoral history, and of course, finally, we've had the Congress declining significantly in 2014 to below 20%, in 19% to be precise, and BJP growing above 30%. And that again was the second time in Indian history that the Congress has not had the largest vote share. Because until then, this 1977 was an aberration. But with the rise of Narendra Modi and his popularity, BJP has now displaced the Congress as the first pole, and the Congress is now the second pole of Indian politics, which means that the second pole, being the weaker pole, will tend to have more allies, because those allies are also threatened by the BJP's rise in their own states. So that happened in 2019 and then 2014 and 2019. And what happened in 2024 is that the opposition coalesced more, and there was a higher index of opposition unity. And therefore, the BJP, despite having 36% vote share in 2024, did not have a majority, whereas in 2014, they had 31%, and they did have a majority. So when we talk about this is the mandate this election has thrown up, that's a bit of a misnomer, because it's not as though any party is winning an absolute majority of votes. It's never happened in Indian history. Even the Congress at its highest won 49% when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and there was a massive wave of sympathy for her. What we've also seen is that the Congress, until 1977, had over 40% vote share in every election. It was only in that election that it was only in that election that they hit 34.5%, and after that again they rebounded above 40 and did not come below that until 1989, when they hit 39. Then by 91 they had hit 36, and after that 96 they hit 28, and they've never gone above 30 since.
So the light blue is the Congress.
So this is both the Congress. The light blue is the seat share of the Congress. The dark blue is the vote share of the Congress. Now, let me show you another map. So this is, since the BJP started as a party and started contesting in 1984, look at how BJP's vote share has grown, even as Congress's vote share has come down. BJP's growth in the 1980s and 90s has largely come from disaffected Congress voters. And that is why the drop in vote share for Congress is almost equal to the rise in vote share for the BJP. This map ends in this graph ends in 2019, but in 2024, the BJP's vote share has gone from 37% to 36%. So it's a 0.8% drop, while the Congress has gone up by about 1.8%. So it's fairly marginal changes. But because many seats are very closely contested, it can shift the overall seat share quite drastically. I should also talk about the socialists who, like I said, they started out with 18%, then they had 10% in the next election, and then they went even further below. But a lot of the leaders of the Janata movements were socialists. So that was a revival for them, and they had an opportunity in the 70s and 80s to emerge as a second pole and even muscle out the BJP if they had made the right choices. But since the 90s, they were fragmented, they've broken up into several different parties, and they've now largely become identitarian aggregators, in the sense that we have a party like RJD in Bihar, which is seen as a Yadav party, but it also gets Muslim votes. That's the MY strategy that they employ, and that they may be getting a few other identity votes on the basis of giving representation in certain seats to certain leaders and things like that. So that's most of the socialist parties have basically become identity-based parties. The JDS is now mostly a Vokaliga party. The Samajwadi party is also a Yadav party, and so on. So they are now, in the last election in 2024, these parties put together had close to 10% of the vote. But because they're fragmented in so many different parties, they are not as influential as they could be. And communism, of course, has waned, not just in India, but globally. And since 2014, they've lost their strongholds in Kerala and in West Bengal and Tripura as well. Their presence is now largely in Kerala, where It remains to be seen how long they're able to hold on, because even in Kerala, we've seen in the recent election the NDA growing its vote share. And if BJP is able to take some of the Christian vote and grow their vote share among Hindus, then it's possible that a lot of the communist vote will consolidate behind the Congress in order to keep out the BJP. So we'll have to see, but it does look really difficult for us to imagine a communist revival in India. The Swatantra Party, of course, it had an ideology that I still think has relevance. It was perhaps too soon for its time. There was too much poverty in India, and the public was simply not willing to accept less redistribution and less state planning. That was the time, of course, when Indira Gandhi was nationalizing industry and abolishing feudal privileges, privy purses, implementing license Raj, and so on. Of course, eventually that was all dismantled largely by the Congress and then later the BJP. And the class of people who have benefited from liberalization in 1991 and later on have now largely become supporters of the BJP. So the final block, of course, is the identity politics block. You see the identity politics starts even before independence. The biggest of them, of course, is the All India Muslim League, and their identitarian struggle was so strong that they ended up getting a separate nation altogether, Pakistan. Then the others, of course, were at that time the Justice Party that later became the Dravida Kazhagam. The DMK and the ADMK come from that. Then there were other parties like the All India Scheduled Caste Federation led by Ambedkar. Today there are parties like the Bahujan Samaj Party. Then there are also parties that are based on linguistic identity, like the Telugu Desam Party. There are parties that don't have a statewide presence but may have presence in certain pockets of a state, like the RLD. So there are a lot of identitarian parties, and they are not as yet capable of articulating any kind of national vision. For the most part, they tend to side with one of the strong poles. So they themselves are unlikely to emerge as a pole, although that has been attempted at times on the plank of regional autonomy and such, but it has never worked. So what is it that we're seeing here? What we're seeing is that in every state, there are most of the time two parties that dominate the political landscape. So of course, everyone will point to UP as an example where more than two parties have been in contention for a while. But that is also an aberration that's, I would say, close to ending. So for a few decades, the Samajwadi Party, the Bahujan Samaj Party, and the BJP were all in contention for power. But that race looks to have been won by the Samajwadi Party, at least for the time being. And now it's become a more bipolar state, with the Bahujan Samaj Party mainly acting as a spoiler for the main two parties. And in fact, a lot of the BJP's losses in 2024 are a result of the BJP, the BSP losing its vote to the SP. In 2014 as well, BJP won virtually the same vote share in UP as it did in 2024, but BJP won about 30 seats less in 2024. And the reason for that is not because of anything the BJP did. It's because other voters are seeing that the BJP is more successful than they imagined it would be. And so they are consolidating against the BJP, and they are saying that rather than vote for the BSP as a protest vote, which is not going to lead to a victory, they'd rather vote for the SP or the Congress, who are in alliance, and therefore try to defeat the BJP. And that process has played out in other states as well. In Tamil Nadu, which is where I come from, the Congress and the DMK used to be the most powerful parties in the 60s. And then the Congress eventually lost power to the DMK, and in a future election actually allied with the DMK. And what ended up following after that was the launch of the ADMK, which by 1977 had quickly become the second pole. And ever since, the Congress has been slowly declining in Tamil Nadu, still having some presence, and they've never really been in contention for power after that. So they've only been able to act as a spoiler or be an ally to one side and essentially play the role of a kingmaker. And this law is something that we see across every state. Right now, one of the states that's in contention is Punjab, where you still have multiple parties: Aam Aadmi Party, Congress, BJP, in contention, but 10, 15 years down the line, chances are that there would have emerged two poles even there. Sometimes you can see one major pole being displaced by another, like ADMK did with the Congress, or like the BJP is now trying to do to the ADMK in Tamil Nadu. But that typically requires some kind of major social movement, and to do it at the national level, it has always required some kind of grand unifying movement. So only, like I said, three parties or three movements have been able to do that. One was Congress because of the independence movement. One was the Janata JP movement in 1977 against the emergency, and the third was the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, which led to the rise of the BJP. It's hard to foresee what might be a potential fourth movement like that at this point. And right, so one of my contentions is that I do not expect there to be Congress Mukt Bharat, and the reason for that is that the Congress and its allies have consolidated the minority, particularly the Muslim vote, which is a very significant vote bloc. They were, as of the last census, somewhere between 14 to 15% of the population in 2011. I'm sure because of higher fertility rates, they've grown slightly from that number now. So any party or any bloc of parties that's able to consolidate that vote behind them already starts with a significant advantage. And from that point onwards, they are able to then also get several Hindu votes, either for ideological reasons or because of transactional reasons. Someone might like a redistributionist policy of theirs, or some other reason, or it could also just be that their identity group is being given representation in terms of tickets and in terms of jobs and things like that. So they're able to get enough of the Hindu vote to prevent Hindu consolidation, which is of course the BJP strategy, and unify the Muslim vote. And therefore, for a third pole to emerge, think about what needs to happen. Let's take the Aam Aadmi Party as an example. They say that they're more competent, they're less corrupt, they're more they have more grassroots reach, and they say that they should be the alternative to the Congress. But what kind of movement could they come up with? If they do come up with something that becomes popular, it's possible that either the BJP or the Congress will co-opt whatever their plank is, and ultimately the voters will come to them because they are far more likely to succeed in an election than the Aam Aadmi Party is at a national level. So it would have to be something that simultaneously wins over the Muslim vote en bloc, but also doesn't alienate too many Hindus so that it's able to win over sufficient number of Hindus. And it should be something that neither the BJP nor the Congress is able to co-opt. So that's quite a daunting challenge, and I'm fairly skeptical that any party will be able to emerge as a third pole and displace the Congress anytime soon. Of course, there's also on the right a lot of talk about how there should be two Hindutva parties and the competition should be between them. But the only route to that is either the Congress becomes a Hindutva party, or the Congress is displaced by another Hindutva party, maybe a Hindu Mahasabha that rises again, or some other new party that starts. But for that to happen, you would need such widespread ideological consensus that, again, it seems extraordinarily daunting to imagine something like that playing out. So, to my contention is that the current political dynamic of having two poles, one being the BJP and one being the Congress, is going to remain the status quo for the next generation at the very least. And now these two poles, one represents the right and one represents the left. And I'll talk about what that is. So the concept of right and left started in France after the revolution, where it was based on which side of the king they were sitting. The right represented, of course, the monarchy and the traditional social hierarchy. And the left were the equalizers, the ones who wanted hierarchies to be gone, the revolutionaries. And by and large, that is still a good way to understand electoral politics in a system like this. I know that a lot of people say that India doesn't really have a traditional left and right, but then I still think the heuristic is very useful. So what is left and what is right? Typically, it breaks down along three axes. One is nationalism. So the right would say, would put more preference for one's own people, one's nation, than it would for some kind of global solidarity. So the left would have a more understated version of nationalism. Many right-wing movements have built their nationalisms on the basis of having a historical enemy, that has happened in Germany against France and so on. Either outside, external, or it can also be an internal enemy, someone who can see a group of people who've seen it as like a fifth column, or just unwilling to integrate into the national culture, right? And I'm not trying to pass any moral judgment here. I'm just trying to describe how this happens. And the left, on the other hand, will have a more understated sense of nationalism, and they will perhaps be far more open to sub-nationalisms and align with those kind of ideologies. They will also have more sympathy for minority groups, and sometimes that takes the form of reactionary anti-majoritarianism, which you sometimes see with Congress spokespersons saying, really demeaning things about Hindus and Hindu culture, which is it's typical of left-wing parties across the world. We've always seen these kind of things happen. So both sides have their pluses and minuses. The second element of division is religion. The left in France, of course, came up with what is called the cult of reason, and they use terms like scientific temper that our own Congress leaders have also used after independence. The right, of course, says that religious morality should have a role in the affairs of state and public life. The left wants to secularize politics to the extent possible. The downside for the left is that most people are pretty attached to their cultural traditions and want to maintain them. But the downside for the right is that if you have multiple religions in one state, then whose religion do you prioritize? And if you prioritize the majority religion, then that leads to counter consolidation of the minority religion, and they side with the left. And so typically left-wing movements across the world, if you look at it, they are pretty sympathetic to minority religions, whether that's in the West or in Israel or even in India. So in India, of course, the role of religion comes down to Articles 25 to 30, the Uniform Civil Code, many of these other issues. Recently, there was a proposed amendment of the Waqf Act. So these are the points of contention on the frame of religion. And the third, of course, is the one that's most well known, which is economics. The right prefers more individual freedom, more markets, more role for markets in the economy. And the left, of course, prefers more central planning, more redistribution, more state intervention. And this, of course, has also been an ongoing contestation in all democracies between the right and the left. In India, one can clearly say that the BJP prioritizes fiscal discipline more than the Congress does. And one can also say that the Congress is more willing to redistribute than the BJP is. So at least on the economics axis, it's very clear who is left and who is right. And arguably, this is also true on the axis of religion. Clearly, one side supported the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and the other did not. Although, of course, there are nuances to this. And even on the question of nationalism, I would say that the BJP takes a more hawkish stance on Pakistan, at least in recent decades, and is more hostile to irregular migration from places like Bangladesh or Rohingya migrants from Myanmar. So, along all these axes, it's very clear that the Congress represents the left pole and the BJP represents the right pole. But in Indian politics, there's also a fourth axis, which is caste. And on this, arguably, there is no strong right-wing position that's being represented, at least in parliament. But the BJP represents somewhat of a status quoist position relative to the Congress and its allies. And the Congress and its allies want even more of an expansion of affirmative action programs for marginalized communities and disadvantaged people. So again, there's a very clear line that shows that one is further to the left than the other. Although one cannot be a purist about this and say that a right-wing party has to represent all of these things and a left-wing party has to represent a set of ideals. So we do have a right and a left. And what is the nature of the divide between them? So in India, the right is integrationist, which is to say that they are the centripetal force. What does that mean? They advocate for national unity. They advocate for having emphasis on common heritage, on national symbols, and they want to have a uniform civil code. They prioritize even infrastructure projects that focus on national integration. So that is the vision of the Indian right. Although again there are quibbles. There, every party supports federal autonomy to some degree, and every party, of course, is also to some degree supportive of schemes for minorities, of reservation programs, and things like that. So it's a question of degree, not absolutes. But at least the longer term vision of the right is one of national integration rather than of group autonomy as much. Whereas the vision of the left in India is largely decentralization. When Rahul Gandhi says that India is a negotiation, what he's arguing for is a case for religious autonomy, regional autonomy, more power devolved to the states, and of course also religious autonomy, which comes in the form of separate personal laws to preserve traditions and identities of different religious groups. It also, of course, comes in the form of advocating for a stronger reservation and, bringing it into private sector as well, which, in a sense, it raises the salience of caste in society, which is the opposite of what the BJP wants to do. The BJP wants to not talk about caste differences. It wants to unify on the basis of being a Hindu, whereas the Congress, of course, would like to foreground the caste identity and say that you are being held back by your caste and we are going to help you get ahead by giving you special privileges. So that's a group rights case that they are making.
So what you are essentially saying is that this is part of their ideology, not vote bank on divide and rule, not accentuates the fault line. Is it an ideology which the Congress is following, or more to get the votes and win the next election of what Rahul is?
So this is a very good question. I think it's a bit of both. So partly, yes, it is because of electoral considerations, because of course it's a democracy and everyone wants to win, right? But I also think that there is significant ideological backing for this, because at least at the ground level, right, there are a lot of genuine fault lines that exist in India that we'll have to recognize and think about how we can heal this, even if you're looking at it from a right-wing standpoint, right? These are realities we have to contend with, and you have to think about how are we going to build this unified nation. And their contention, and many people would say that linguistic minorities should be able to preserve their languages, and that there should not be one common language that ends up, let's say, decimating their linguistic heritage. Of course, nobody is proposing that. I'm not trying to strawman here, but I'm saying at least at that level, you can understand why there was a case for linguistic states, and I do think there was deep ideological support for a lot of it on the ground. And now there's, of course, also a lot of disparity between states in terms of economic outcomes. And that is something that there is genuine grievance over, and it's going to be a challenging thing to deal with. Another issue on the linguistic side is, in 1951, in the first census, 37% of India's population were native Hindi speakers. By 2011, it was 43%, but by 2041, it's projected to be 61%, right? Now, I have no issue with this. I don't really care who speaks which language, but it is the kind of demographic shift, largely due to fertility, that is going to change culture across the country, because you're going to see more of these Hindi state migrants going to other states, because the income disparity is there, and they also have lower fertility, so there's more need for workers. And that kind of interaction can, if managed well, lead to good national integration. But at the same time, it also heightens linguistic chauvinism and exclusivist identity politics, at least among some segment of the population. So at that level, yes, there is some degree of ideological clash. And then, of course, on the religious side, if you want to win the Muslim vote, what are you going to campaign on? So the Congress, of course, talks about secularism and support for minority rights. And the Narasimha Rao government came up with the Waqf Act, the Places of Worship Act. There was the Minority Commission that was set up, and so many different moves that they made, which arguably have been effective in securing the Muslim vote. There's been significant consolidation, right? So this is, yes, partly instrumental, but then among the supporters, at least, there is significant ideological support, and that's what I'm talking about. The leadership is usually responsive to ideological proclivities of its supporters. At least that's how a democracy is supposed to work, and to a large degree, I do think it does, although there are constraints on what can be done, which we'll come to in a bit. And of course, on the question of caste as well, it's a deeply divisive topic in India. This itself could be a whole talk, but virtually every group feels some sense of grievance because of how they have been treated historically, or the amount of opportunities they're having. And this is, what you would expect in a country where you have this level of per capita income and much heightened aspirations. And is in a country like India, where we're seeing fairly high growth rates, what happens is that as incomes rise, we also see inequality rises. And this typically happens for a while, after which inequality declines. That's called the Kuznets curve. And for some countries, the curve doesn't exactly work like a curve. There are variations. But broadly, what happens is that at this stage of development, we're going to see more inequality. And that's not a bad thing. That's how this process works out. But it does tend to create resentments. And we see this across democracies. And it's just this resentment manifests in the form of identity. And in India, that identity turns out to be caste. So that's the thing. Ultimately, at the level of the ground supporters, we do have these ideological clashes, and a large number of people do believe in these worldviews. And it also has institutional leadership and support. We see media pushing these narratives. We see academics producing papers in the social sciences and humanities talking about these kind of ideas. So there is massive institutional support for these ideas, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. Economic development largely comes down to three things, right? Structural reforms, state capacity building, and industrial policy. Every country that's developed has done some combination of these three things. Structural reform is things like land acquisition reform, labor reforms, the farm laws that we brought a few years ago. State capacity building would be improving the quality of education, especially at the secondary school level. It's infrastructure, building roads, inland waterways, things like that. It's improving the health of the population, which, of course, even schemes like Swachh Bharat do, because it reduces the number of deaths due to diarrhea. And state capacity also, of course, includes things like having access to minerals, building supply chains, so those kind of things. And then industrial policy, actually that's where the supply chains part comes. Industrial policy is like the PLI schemes that we have. We are backing a few national champions, so to speak. That's what they're called in at least East Asian countries. And that is basically giving your manufacturers a subsidy or an advantage that helps them compete against foreign competitors. And it is good at this stage, at least. Some people say it leads to trade distortions and free trade is good. Ideally, it is. But if you want to industrialize, at least at a certain stage of development, industrial policy is also good. And it has worked out, especially for countries like South Korea, where so many of these big South Korean brands that we see were actually launched and supported by Park Chung-hee several decades ago. So the question of the next 25 years is going to be how are we going to navigate these three areas of economic growth: structural reform, state capacity building, and industrial policy.
You raised a very valid point of these structural reforms. And what you also mentioned was something related to farm laws that were created. Now, if you look at those farm laws that were put in around 4 or 5 years back, and there was a lot of narrative that was created by the other side of the pole, right, which actually didn't work out. So how should we control this narrative? Or how should the right be controlling the narrative if it's being set up by them, or the other way around? Just make sure that the nation actually grows.
Right, that's a very good question, and I wish I had a good answer to that. But it is going to be very hard to win this narrative battle, especially for economic reforms, largely because of this inequality that I talked about before. And it's in a poor society, it's very easy to instigate resentment and envy against those who are more successful. That is not a moral judgment. It's just if you're going to see your own children die of hunger and you're struggling to even feed your own, obviously that creates incentives for you to want to somehow get ahead. And you see other people getting ahead. And if somebody tells you they're getting ahead because they're cheating or it's unfair and they're exploiting you, you are going to be receptive to that, right? So it's going to be very, very hard to win that kind of narrative. And partly that's why India has always done what is called reform by stealth, which is basically reforming only when there's a crisis and trying to do it in a way that it doesn't attract too much public attention. And unfortunately, I think that status quo will continue at least for a while. Hopefully, eventually we build a block of support for economic reforms where people see that, hey, these moves have been done and now I'm benefiting from it, and they internalize it. And then the public narrative could eventually shift, but it's going to take a lot of intellectual work, and it's going to take a lot of work at the ground level trying to spread these narratives. It's a lot easier for the other side. They have a structural advantage here, and I don't think there's any way to counter that in the short term.
In his point, what he based narrative, you said, was it really narrative or was it political motivated? 100%, I would say, what you are talking about is farm laws. Which,
Right.
For instance, everybody, 98% of the farmers know they are being exploited by the broker, by the middleman. And that was trying to get rid of it. But those people, they used their narrative to build up that it was not really by the poor people who are suffering. It was made it that.
That's right.
Exactly.
That phenomenon is called rent seeking. So they are called the rentier class, and in the Indian economy there are many classes of rentiers, and they have vested interests, and they also have significant influence, right? So anytime you want to pursue a reform, you're going to have to, you will have winners and losers, and the losers in these cases tend to be groups that are already really powerful. So they will do everything in their power to mobilize opposition to those reforms. And sometimes, unfortunately, they end up succeeding. But that's because of thermostatic public opinion. Anytime you try to deviate from the status quo too much, at least what we've seen in Indian politics so far is that you end up losing that election. It happened to Narasimha Rao, it happened to Vajpayee, it almost happened to Modi this time. So it's a very hard problem to tackle, and you need more and more. So the people who are opposing the reforms are very, very motivated to do it, right? The people who support it don't have quite as much motivation because the winners are very dispersed, whereas the losers are very concentrated.
I have to go somewhere. So I'll ask you one question and then I'll find. You think what is happening is people are basically talking of not Rahul Gandhi or the Congress or the second pole. They're talking of the deep state. They're talking of George Soros. They're talking of certain other international players who don't want India to rise. And they are influencing, funding, investments are coming in to see that the growth is tiny. So what is your take on that? Because if you want to reform by stealth, it will take that much longer. If you want to do it at a fast pace with all that global thing and the social media in work, if it will become increasingly difficult. So are we heading to a middle income trap, and then the points kind of peter out, or you see that there's going to be a success story in the backdrop of the democracy?
Okay, so my contention is that India will succeed in developing, and I have a number of reasons why. One, of course, is a very overwrought trope, which is, of course, our demographic dividend. And there is a real amount of truth to this. Our demographic dividend is not simply the number of people, but also the quality of the human capital. It has been significantly improving. We see fewer and fewer children being stunted due to malnutrition. We see a higher gross enrollment ratio during every decade. We see fewer child marriages. We see a lot less infant mortality. Our maternal mortality is dropping. So the quality of our human capital is improving, and that's a very real thing. Our population's cognitive capabilities are improving. You can see surveys where they show that our time preference is increasing. Time preference meaning the ability to have longer term aspirations and essentially delay gratification. Of course, that is also countered by the rise of smartphones and social media, which is pushing down on those things. But we are also seeing more adherence to the law. If you look at data on how riots, how many riots happen in a year, that's been declining pretty consistently over the decades. Our police force is still quite inadequate in many ways. It needs a lot more staffing. It needs more funding, more training, but it is improving slowly. So the demographic dividend is real. So that's the first thing. The second one is, of course, technology. Narendra Modi during this recent election has promised energy independence by 2047, which would be quite phenomenal if it's accomplished. But there have been significant breakthroughs in energy technology, which is driving down prices and making it possible for India to also undergo an energy transition. Energy is just one aspect. We also have drones. We're making advancements in space, in communications technology. Of course, now we have broad-based access to banking and things like that. So the adoption of technology is another one. And the third would be we're seeing more and more formalization of the economy. And because of that, our financial intermediation has gotten much higher. I grew up here in India, and I left India, I think, in 2016. Now I'm back here after 8 years, and everyone is using digital payments. That was just not the case a decade ago when I was here. So that is a huge and important part of India's growth story. Then we are already seeing some reforms that have been made, GST and such, which have created a national integrated market. That will also have its benefits going down the line. So there are many reasons to expect that the Indian growth story is going to be strong, and we will continue to grow despite, of course, setbacks in terms of our reforms, despite political issues. As long as we're able to maintain our macroeconomic stability, we'll be able to do well. One thing that we've observed in developing countries across the world is that the moment you lose macroeconomic stability, then your growth story gets hit for a decade. Look at Sri Lanka now, or look at Indonesia during the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s. And if you pursue really reckless left-wing economic policies, sometimes you end up like Argentina or Venezuela, which have had several lost decades of growth. So that is a threat, and ideally the political system should try to prevent veering that far to the left. But short of something like that happening, I think the Indian growth story is going to remain strong. We have seen after the COVID years pretty strong growth in the past few years, and there's good reason to believe that it will continue. There are, of course, geopolitical challenges as well. The Russia-Ukraine war is estimated to have cost $2 trillion to the global economy. If there is ever a North Korea-South Korea war, it would cost twice as much, $4 trillion. And if there is a war between China and the US over Taiwan, that would cost something like $12 trillion. And that's a very conservative estimate. It could well be much more than that. So we have supply chain risks that come from all of these things. And of course, we ourselves are at risk of getting into a catastrophic war with China. So those are sort of tail risks that we have to be very, very wary about, and we have to try and both establish deterrence on the one hand, as well as try to prevent any kind of negative impact that happens as and when these wars break out, or any even any trade route getting disrupted. Like the Houthis are now disrupting trade in the Red Sea, and that's leading to higher inflation here. So we will have to think about how we are going to address those things if they happen, and we have to have contingency plans. But yes, broadly, I am very optimistic that India will do well. Let's broadly think of this as like American intelligence operations, right? So I do think that American intelligence is always trying to influence culture and narratives everywhere, because they are a superpower, and since at least the 80s, they've had psyops and things like that, and even before. So that is natural. The question is how other states like India should handle it, right? Especially India. Now, what is India's role in the system? Actually, let's start with what is America's role in the system. America won World War II, and as a result, has established its hegemony over Western Europe. And it has several military bases there. It has the NATO alliance and EU and structures like that, which are largely favorable to US interests. And nothing nefarious about this either. Those countries also wanted to join NATO for the most part. And of course, it also is now, it has what is called the island chain containment strategy for China. So the first island chain is Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, that area. So they have bases in Japan, they have bases in the Philippines, they have a base in South Korea.
They wanted to create another base in Bangladesh, which she refused.
So that is their primary theatre now. For most of their history, the Western European theatre has been their most important theatre of conflict. Now, because of the rise of China, the Western Pacific theatre is the most important one for their geopolitical interests. And so these two areas, they will always continue to maintain that influence. Where else do they have military bases? They have a lot of military bases in and around the Middle East, largely to protect energy supply chains. So these are their primary interests. Right now, America has a national security strategy of fighting one war at one time, not two wars. Until 2018, it used to be a two-war strategy. They wanted to have the capability to fight two wars at the same time. But because defense spending has significantly declined since the era of the Cold War, they are no longer in a position to be able to fight two wars at the same time. There's also been a lot of stimulus spending, first due to the 2008 financial crisis and later due to COVID. So America's debt to GDP ratio is quite high, and now that interest rates have gone up, they're spending more on interest every year. So actually, they're spending more on interest every year than they are on defense. And then the next issue that's there is because in 1995, Bill Clinton passed a bill that made the defense industrial complex base kind of consolidate. So instead of having several small defense contractors, you now have a few very large defense contractors. And the problem with this, of course, there's a lot of corruption involved and all that, but let's not get into that. The problem with this is not so much the corruption, it's that they are not able to produce as much. The amount of munitions they were producing in 1995 was 30 times as many as they're producing now, and they're just not able to ramp up munition production despite the war in Ukraine. They are building ships at the rate of, China is building ships at 200 times the rate at which the US is building ships. And if there is a battle with China, it's going to be a naval war, it's going to be amphibious warfare. So there are all these defense supply chain challenges. And the US itself has deindustrialized since the 2000s. The share of the US economy that goes to manufacturing has dropped since then, and it will take another 10-15 years to increase that. It has started increasing now. They've brought in some industrial policy. There's a CHIPS Act for semiconductors. There's the Inflation Reduction Act, which is largely clean energy industrial policy. And there's also an infrastructure bill that they passed, and they're building it out. But the point is, for America to be where it was in terms of its ability to deter its adversaries, it'll take several years to get there. And right now, it's at a weak spot. So when the Houthis started attacking ships in the Red Sea, historically, it was America's role to protect the various trade choke points, right? But now they have basically given up. There's still some nominal effort they're making, but shipping has not gone through the Red Sea for several months now. So that is an indicator of where there are American weaknesses.
America is failing.
Well, I would not say failing, but at this task at least, right?
Their things are.
Right. So they face significant challenges. And at the same time, now China is the biggest manufacturing power in the world. And their defense budget is actually believed to be much higher than public figures state. And they've also had a massive defense build-up in the past decade and a half. And on top of that, China now is able to procure whatever minerals and resources it wanted from Russia that it doesn't itself have access to. So we're no longer in a unipolar US-dominated era. And because of the rise of China, we are going to see a much more contested world in the decades ahead. And the rise of India will further change those dynamics. So as India rises, yes, there will be some skepticism of India from different sides, and there will be efforts to maybe temper that rise, or at least in terms of its geopolitical powers. And India will have to deal with that. But at the same time, I would caution against having complete opposition to foreign ideas and foreign investments and such, because for India's growth, these things are necessary. What we should, at least from our side, focus on, I'll get to the offense part, but at least at a defensive level, right? What we should focus on is trying to have high quality institutions, sound policy, political stability, and try to heal the fault lines within our society to the extent that they are not easy for any adverse power to potentially exploit. As far as offense goes, our foreign service is severely limited in terms of its personnel. It's very small. Our intelligence services also need a boost, but then
Where intelligence services really need.
absolutely. But then our defense budget itself is a very, very small percentage of our GDP. And in fact, in the last 10 years, the defense budget has been declining. And we also don't have autonomy in terms of arms production. We are not at this point capable of fighting a long-term war. So in any war, if both sides can last the first few weeks, whoever is better at being able to manufacture and have supplies and logistics, they are more likely to win. So until India can kind of figure out these things, it's going to be harder to go on the offense, because the other side will have a lot more leverage over India that they can use than India is going to have over them. So what China did, of course, was Deng Xiaoping's famous policy of hide your strength and bide your time. So they got more and more integrated into global supply chains. They reduced their vulnerabilities. China actually imports a lot of its food and energy, but they've had their Belt and Road Initiative. They're building all these trade routes, and they're securing their supplies. They've also built up massive financial reserves. And, actually India is also taking some of these steps, albeit very quietly. India is now building the INSTC, the International North-South Transport Corridor to Russia through Iran. India also now has this new agreement with the Europeans and some Middle Eastern countries. The India-Middle East-Europe corridor, it goes through UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and all the way to Greece. And India has acquired a port in Myanmar, Sittwe Port, and is building a corridor from India to Myanmar to Thailand. So due to partition, we've already lost access to several of our historical trade routes. And these are efforts to make up for that. And I think as we build these trade routes, as our internal logistics also improve so that the cost of logistics drop, we are going to have more and more manufacturing. As we have more manufacturing, we get more autonomy. We also build more leverage over other countries. And so that is, I think, the way this is going to go. I do think that we can have some intelligence operations here and there. I'm not qualified to comment on what exactly is happening, but I don't think ultimately that will be enough to deter foreign adversaries that want India's interests.
My idea is a little bit of this much offense
Okay.
will reduce their thing this much.
Is that like the madman theory that Nixon had, where he was considered to be crazy enough to actually risk nuclear war, and so the Soviets were deterred by that, right? So a little bit of that unpredictability, injecting that into the relationship, I guess that could work. It's definitely a theory worth exploring. Has any Indian leader ever tried that in your experience?
Not so far, but I'm propagating it quite a bit.
Okay. Would you say that Indira Gandhi's 1971 approach was something akin to that?
See, now between you and me, in a way, yes, in a way, no.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, had she done it wisely, with 95,000 POWs with us, she could have bargained much, much better. That would have given an edge to India for that war.
Right.
Where we lost a lot. But we did not make up anything because of stupidity, of not having made a good bargain.
Right. But what do you think of the period leading up to the war? How she managed that?
That,
Would you say that
again,
was...
That again, she was stupid enough to tell by Churjao, it was only because of Manekshaw that he said, no, we'll get cleaned out. Let's wait till the monsoons are over. And he carried his resignation letter when he was going to refuse that.
Right.
So, I don't think she was very wise that way.
Right.
She had good ministers or good people to support
Good
her.
people.
Otherwise, it would have been a disaster for India.
Yeah, but it was the biggest, I would argue, the most comprehensive military victory since the Second World War anywhere in the world.
No, that I
The Korean War ended in a stalemate. Vietnam was, the North Vietnamese won.
No, first time new country was.
Exactly.
That I agree. But again, how stupid of create Bhindranwale and then try to control it. You see, if you live with a gun, you go up in smoke. That's an old Ganesh.
Right, right.
So she tried to live with the gun.
Absolutely.
So I'll just make my last few points. So the right, at the very least, has the incentive to try and alter certain elements of India's constitution. The Indian left is far more satisfied with the constitutional and even statutory status quo, because for most of India's history, it has been the Congress party and even the Janata parties, who arguably be on the left, who've been ruling India. And because of that, their base is not as set on changing the constitution as much as they are at defending it. And because they are the defenders and the right, in some sense, is the attackers, which is because the right, of course, did not really win the 1945 election. The path forward for the right is going to be a lot harder than the path forward for the left, even if the right keeps winning elections and forming governments. Because every law that the right wants to change is going to require a majority not just in the Lok Sabha but in the Rajya Sabha. And the Rajya Sabha is not first past the post, it's proportional representation. So that majority is much harder to build. So 2 points here. One, you are right that once an entitlement passes, it's very hard to take it back. And therefore, even if that leads to backlash and maybe electoral punishment, the status quo has been once changed and it remains changed for the most part. On the other hand, I would argue against what you're saying simply because I think that political stability in itself has great value, and inciting that kind of violence and that kind of instability is not really good for India's growth story. It's not good for the Indian people. And arguably, if you look back at the time when emergency happened, when those things were done, it didn't generate good growth outcomes. It didn't generate... look, if you care about the country, those are also considerations that you have to keep in mind. And it's better to go through a lawful process. So Congress won 74%, 75%, 73%, and 68% in 4 of the 5 elections that happened right after India became independent. So that is possible. You can win that much in the Lok Sabha. However, how do you get that number in the Rajya Sabha? Because in the Rajya Sabha, it is some form of proportional representation at the state level. And because of that, you can't get 67% of Rajya Sabha members, even in the best case with optimal sort of geographic concentration, unless you have 55% or higher of the national vote. And therefore, for the BJP to want to change the constitution, it will always require other parties to support it. So I would argue that the Congress coalition right now is much more ideologically coherent, whereas the BJP and its allies have a lot of ideological differences between them. The path forward for the BJP must be to try and persuade its coalition partners to adopt some of its ideological planks, and also to try and build outreach to voters who vote for the other parties, so that at least at the level of public opinion, the level of consensus for these constitutional changes can come up to 65%, 70%, maybe even higher. Because if you're going to make any change to what is now a stable system, it should require that degree of consensus before something like that would be, first of all, be worthwhile in terms of the disruption, and secondly, would force enough of the other parties to acquiesce to the change. That's kind of what happened with Article 370 in 2019, for example. That was, although it was not passed as a constitutional amendment, it did receive 2/3 support in both houses. And that was because there was widespread public consensus on changing that article. So whatever changes that they want to make, and I'm not saying they shouldn't make any changes, it should still have that degree of careful consensus building. And I would argue that doing it the way that some of our former leaders, especially Indira Gandhi, have done, would be detrimental to India's interests and even to the BJP's own interests. I mean, how well has the Congress party fared since Indira Gandhi's time? So arguably that sowed the seeds of their own decline, and the BJP should not make the same mistake. At the same time, I would also want to assuage some of the fears that people have that if the Congress and its allies ever come to power, we're going to see a civil war. There's literature on this by Fioron and Leighton, who've studied all the civil wars that have happened since 1945. And what they say is that the conditions that lead to civil war are largely weak states, transitional periods, having geographic formations like mountains that enable guerrilla warfare, like in Afghanistan. It's usually not because of dictatorship. It really has weak ties to things like ethnic fractionalization or discrimination. So we've had fairly left-wing governments in our history, and we've not really seen civil war. I don't think we're going to see civil war. It's a very unlikely outcome. So it's not the end of the world if the Congress wins. However, it does create concerns about what happens to our fiscal balance and macroeconomic stability. So we all have an interest in pushing back on those policies and getting that into the narrative that fiscal responsibility is really important, and that's a fight that is going to be hard to win, but that's going to be important in the next several years. Of course, on the side of culture, if the Congress comes and implements some of their promises, again, I don't think it's the end of the world. I think it will probably mean that. So, I mean, a lot of these things are just relative status differences type things, right? It'll probably mean that the educational curriculum will be a little different, a bit further to the left than it is now. It'll mean that in terms of who gets appointed to government jobs and things, there will be some shifts in that. But then again, public sector jobs are only a small percentage of jobs. So for most people, it doesn't really affect their life. And it's mostly the chattering class people like us who talk about these things more. I do think that some of these policies can have detrimental economic impacts, but even though I personally don't align with the consociational view of things, I'm able to see that they have some at least legitimate points, and we have to work to recognize and synthesize the legitimate points on both sides. The fact of the matter is, even going forward, our country is going to have a large segment of people who support consociational views and a large segment of people who support integrationist views. And because both have massive funding, massive institutional support and leaders, I don't think we're ever going to have a total victory of one side over another. And because democracy is a continuing game in that sense, what we need to try and do is to make sure the stakes are not existential in every election, because that basically leads to what is termed in political science as pernicious polarization. And when you have something like that happen, it becomes a cycle that's very hard to break out of. It's called a Schmittian vortex. And India is already on the path to getting there. And so I would like to see a politics where we're not demonizing the other side as much, where the left isn't calling the right intolerant and bigoted all the time, where the right doesn't look at everyone who's on the left as lazy or anti-establishment. I do think, at least at the social level, like we all have relatives who are on the other side of the political spectrum. We still talk to them. We meet them at functions. We're not as polarized as a society. It's our politicians at some level who, or at least our intellectual elites, who are far more polarized. And this is going to be a controversial point, but I think that actually on the left, the quality of their epistemic institutions is also better. There's a reason why the left dominates humanities and social sciences. So I would say what the right needs to do is to try to build institutions of that same quality, and that's the path to seeking power culturally and otherwise. And at the same time, there's also the broader challenge that both sides should focus on, which is how do we improve the culture of the Indian people? How do we make sure that people's cognitive abilities are higher? How do we make sure that we're less prone to certain non-communicable diseases, which the Indian subcontinent itself is very prone to? How do we make sure that our people become more adherent to laws and customs, like not spitting on the road, those kind of things? How do we, make sure that our people think about resolving disputes primarily through lawful processes as opposed to violent processes? How do we make sure that there's higher social trust? What is social trust? Social trust is if you're able to have commercial transactions with people who are not your kin or your friends, and have some degree of trust that you will not be screwed over in that transaction. That is social trust. If you can leave a bag outside and come back in 10 minutes and pick it up and have the faith that it's not going to be stolen from you, someone's not going to take it, that is social trust. And India, as such, needs to work on increasing the level of social trust it has. If we can do that across these various identitarian divides, that is the path to achieving the integrationist vision. It cannot happen primarily through politics. It has to happen at the level of society first, and politics follows society, follows culture. So that, I would say, is something that both sides should focus on. To the left, I would say maybe rely on outrage a bit less. It works out for in the short term for one election cycle, but everything we know about organizational behavior, everything we know about leadership suggests that the more you flagellate your employees, the more eventually they're going to have exhaustion and burnout. Initially, they might work harder, and that's kind of what happens with politics, with activism, with social movements as well. And people and countries and your own political base can become socially exhausted if you are keeping them in a constant state of outrage, because outrage it's like self-punishment. You are always imposing a psychic cost on yourself, and you can only do that for a certain period of time. I'll give you an example on that. So in 2020, the Democratic Party in the US went pretty hard on issues of racial and social justice, policing reform, criminal justice reform, things like that. Or basically the package of issues that today gets called wokeness on the right. But if you look at their 2020 platform and their 2024 platform, they've significantly moderated all those things in the 24 platform, because that level of energy can only be sustained for a very short period of time. The mention of racial justice has been reduced from double-digit numbers to, I think, something like 2 times in this year's platform. And many of the more left-wing economic policies that the Democrats wanted in the 2020 platform, they have now removed it, and they're boasting about relatively moderate things as their accomplishments. And so that's something that also tends to happen with parties, and I think it would be good for the Congress and its allies to consider moderating on some of these issues. And in fact, that might actually help them win even more votes, because right now there are a lot of people who will simply not vote for them because they're seen as reactionarily anti-Hindu. They're seen as too irresponsible fiscally, and I know a lot of those people, and the thing is, those are the middle of the ground voters that they would need to win if they want to come to power. And especially if they want to come to power with a stable government where the central party that's leading the coalition has a significant chunk of seats, rather than like a very small chunk and then supported by a lot of smaller parties. So my advice to them would be to try and moderate on some of these issues. To the right, of course, I would say work on building institutions and improving the epistemic quality of those institutions. To not engage in conspiratorial thinking, to be rigorous in any assertions that they make, because ultimately both sides ought to have a positive, optimistic, hopeful vision for the country, and that's what the country deserves, and I think that's what our leadership class should give. My, I guess, final point would be what's next, and I would say the 2029 election is going to be really pivotal in India's history, because by 2034, most of today's Indian political leaders are going to be gone from the scene, except for a handful of parties, which obviously includes Rahul Gandhi and the Congress, maybe the Aam Aadmi Party, Trinamool Congress, Shiv Sena, and a couple of other parties. Almost everyone in the leadership scene is in their 70s, and as a result, we're going to see that a new generation of leadership takes over, and for that turnover to happen at this level, it's the first time in several decades. These are leaders we've seen since the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Most of us have grown up our whole lives watching these leaders. And so when they're gone, that's an opportunity for parties to also shift their positioning, the way they organize. Many of them, of course, are dynastic parties, which means that we already know who the next leader is going to be. But they also come from a different context in terms of the culture they grew up with, the kind of technology they had access to. They're from a different time, and I think they should come up with new ideas. And what matters is how this transition is handled. So parties should promote their new leaders right from now, so that there's sufficient public support for them when they eventually have to take over. A really good example of that is how Karunanidhi promoted Stalin in Tamil Nadu. I'm not a fan of the DMK, but it was, as a political maneuver, really well done. And if other parties, especially the BJP as well, can identify a successor and groom them and then put them in that position, I think whichever party manages that well is more likely to succeed. And of course, the next election also determines who's going to oversee India's transition to upper middle income status, which means that after that, the nature of our economy is going to be much different from what it is today. Definitely very different from what it was in 2014. We'll have a much broader middle class. We'll have a much larger share of the population that's urban. We're probably going to have delimitation at some point. That means that urban constituencies are likely to gain more in power. So those are all big shifts that are coming. Plus, of course, the linguistic demographic shift. Possibly also religious. We'll see what the census shows up. So those are big changes that are coming. The India of the future is going to look quite different. We'll still see the same parties and the same democracy, but the question of who wins is still yet to be answered. What I can tell you is that I don't think India will become a dictatorship. I think there are several structural reasons why it's very, very hard to impose a dictatorship in India. So what we should try to do is improve the quality of outcomes that Indian democracy is able to throw up. And I would even say India should become more democratic in some senses, which is that our freedom of expression laws are quite constrained. We have provisions like preventive detention in the Constitution. But how do you actually remove those without creating social chaos? How do you do that without, people fighting each other over blasphemy and things like that? I think that requires significant effort in police and judicial reform. I think our state capacity to enforce the rule of law must be very strong. The state has to have absolute monopoly on violence. And as soon as we're able to establish that, I think we should give people more individual liberty, more freedom to speak their mind, and have less state intervention in people's lives as well as in the economy. I think we should privatize more, not completely, but have more of a role for the private sector in the economy. That's going to be good for our growth. So that's the battle ahead. The question is, how can we as individuals and citizens work to improve the functioning and quality of our democracy? And how can we ensure that the outcomes that we want, whatever each of us wants, get done? So democracy is a somewhat responsive system, as we have seen throughout the story. And I do have a lot of faith in Indian democracy and the Indian people. So let's hope for the best. And thank you so much.